A Tall Tale by Alexander Kane Duncan.
This is a tall tale. By that I don't mean it's a flippant fancy, for every word put down here is as true now as it was then.
It is a tall tale because it concerns
Miranda Slicket.
And if the folk of Hope Village were given but one word to describe Miranda Slicket, I wager the large part would choose the word tall.
Other words like severe, stern, and scary might be bandied around, but never settled upon. Miranda Slicket was perhaps all these things, yet to the humble eyes of Hope, she was as a gatepost is to a buttercup.
On a summer's day, should she be caught standing still on the floor, Mr. Brown the butcher would swear he could tell what the time was simply by the shadow she cast. Mr. Burns the baker would laugh at this and tease him that she cast a shadow no matter the season and the temperament of the sky, that she cast a shadow at dusk in winter.
That she even cast a shadow at night.
This was unfair. She didn't cast a shadow at night, unless the moon was fat, but this is no different from you or I. She did, however, carry a small brass bell, no bigger than her thumb, tied with a black ribbon to her waist, and this, I dare say, is different from you or I. Its quiet tinkling could be heard wherever she went, a siren to those near to remember their P's and Q's, and not to be spoken unless spoken to, and to keep their elbows off the table if you don't mind, and it's not too much trouble, and all the etiquette their Mars and Pars had taught them that had long since blown away. One terse glance from Miss Slicket could crumble the most bumptious of folk, while the Major himself would blush with guilt as she pedalled past on her bone shaker, tutting and tinkling.
Up the hill of Hope she would pedal each morning, and down again she would speed every evening, her gown spread out behind her like a raven. None knew if she took pleasure in this or in anything, for a smile never cracked her creaseless face.
No one could ever remember seeing her smile.
Rumour has it that she once grinned at Mr. Cox, the candlestick maker, for scenting her wax of rose water on harvest day. But as we all know, whenever rumour has it, rumour often hasn't it all. For truth be told, it would be a fine credit indeed to be the man who have made Miranda Slicket smile.
Lovely morning.
Mr. Carroll the churchwarden would cry.
Would you care to?
Mrs. Thomas the tailor would begin, and
did you hear the one about?
Mr. Trigger the tanner would try.
All were greeted with a glance, a shake of the head, or, more often than not, a touch, as she went past and up the hill.
On its summit, two watchful pillars stood side by side, two judges frowning down on the village at their feet. And though her habit was black, it was not the church for Miranda Slicket, but its neighbour. There was, after all, only one job for her. It was inevitable.
I am a school teacher.
The children of Hope cursed the day. They were first sent on their way up the hill to school. They soon found out there was no fun to be had there, and playtime had become something that apparently happened to other children.
At Hope Village School, the day began promptly with lining up shortest at the front, tallest at the back, in the grounds of the looming grey building. The children were then led single file, right foot first, through the front door, the hall, and into the classroom, where they quickly hung up their coats and sat at the separate desks, watching the towering figure of Miss Slicket scratch out the morning's arithmetic on the blackboard.
No one would dare make a sound of the screech of the chalk marking out their work. They feared the shame of her stare, the dunce's hat, or even the sting of the cane. They were familiar with all three.
Once the board was corner to corner with white sums, Miss Slicket would turn round and glare at the class of sit up straight, arms folded, eyes front children and point.
One child would leap from their chair, hurry to the front of the class, and place a slate and a piece of chalk onto every desk before returning and waiting for Miss Slicket's first and sometimes only words of the day.
You may begin.
She needed to say a little more. There was an entire language to her gestures and tics that the class were quick to pick up on. For instance, a slight backward bobbing on the head clearly meant,
Child, collect the slates, then choose a book to read out to the class.
Naughty Harriet and the matches will do.
A left slant of the head with a raised right eyebrow plainly meant.
Deceased with your sulking, girl, and make sure you have that pinafore washed by tomorrow.
And a double wide-eyed stare down the nose obviously meant.
Francis Farley, if I so much as catch you staring at Henrietta Hodges' ankles once more, you shall go to the wall and choose which cane you would like me to beat you with. After writing came lunch, then reading, where they would all wait for Miss Slickett's deep single nod of the head to announce the end of another day.
As soon as they had left the grounds and passed beyond the gate, single file, right foot first, shortest at the front, tallest at the back, they would all escape down the hill and play blind man's bluff and hopscotch in the remaining light of the day. Play that was until they heard the tinkling of Miss Slickett's bell as she sped down the hill. Then they would scrabble into their homes, shut the door, and think not on her until the next morning.
This would go on, day in, day out, week after week, for many more pages you can bet here, every day the same. But as I'm sure you know, that would be no story at all. The stories slip and slide away from the day in, day out, week after week. When this story fell from Miranda Slickett's grasp, she lifted her head and asked,
"What did you say, child?"
I said I was wondering if I might read this one to the class today, miss,
said Billy Bamford, holding up a small book with a bright cover full of sprites and pucks with wide grins. "The title, child, the title?"
A Midsummer's Night's Dreams by Mr. William Shakespeare.
Miss Slickett raised her left eyebrow and moved her lips into a grimace. This would usually mean,
"Remember, if one of you fails the test, you will all have to take it again tomorrow."
but Billy Bamford stood still and waited.
"And why that particular story, child?"
I hear from my dad that it's full of fairies and magic and such, and learning of fairies and magic, and such is right important if you're to know what to do should you find yourself in their company.
By this time, not one child had their eyes on their slates. They were all staring, eyes wide, mouths open, at Miss Slickett.
She held the gaze of Billy Bamford and leaned forward across her desk. He'd never seen her do this before, but it seemed to mean,
"Now you listen to me, boy. I'm only going to say this once, so I suggest you take heed, or I will make it very uncomfortable for you to ever sit down again."
She leaned in closer still, and the silence became hot.
"Fairies and magic and such,"
she began, her voice the whisper of a storm.
"There is no such stuff."
Before he could say,
But Miss Slickett, I don't think I could bear reading another tale of some poor urchin who drowned in a sewer whilst looking for pennies.
Miss Slickett pointed to the shelf, and Billy Bamford replaced the book, taking instead Silly Simon and the Train Tracks. Only once for the rest of that day did he look up and see Miss Slickett distant and alone behind her desk, a faraway look in her eyes that he couldn't take to mean anything at all. He was all the talk that evening and patted on the back so many times he began to stoop.
Such a thing would have been fuel for a plenty an evening's banter, were it not for the next morning when Miss Slickett stood before the class and said,
"Children, I'd like to introduce you to Robin Goody." The class followed Miss Slickett's arms, which rested on the shoulders of a boy so short, so slight, and so grubby that she might as well have been holding on to a chimney brush. "Robin will be joining us from now on,"
she said, brushing a finger under her nose, which everyone knew meant,
"That's all this class needs. Another animal. Why doesn't he go back to the barn where he belongs? Robin, go and sit next to Billy. There's a good boy."
She moved the grubby boy away from her and patted the black dust off her hands.
Robin strode down the aisle of desks, releasing a small cloud of black dust with every step, and beamed a shining white smile at Billy as he sat down at the desk next to him and wiped his nose on his sleeve. Billy nodded a hello and went to fetch him a slate and chalk of his own.
And so the pages of Miranda Slickett's story blew in the wind. When she rose from her bed and pedalled up Hope Hill that morning, the last thing she expected was for her classroom to be disturbed. Not once, not twice, but more times than she had fingers and cared to count.
Arithmetic had barely started before it was interrupted by a bout of sneezes breaking out near the back of the class. When she turned towards the noise, she saw the new boy, Robin Goody, rocking back and forth in a cloud of dust and phlegm that could have flattened a small house.
He finally settled back down and relaxed into his chair, wiped the sweat from his forehead, picked his nose, licked the end of his finger with a big grin.
Miss Slickett blinked blank-faced several times. Ella Edward took this to Maine.
I don't quite know what to say about that.
Frances Farley took this to Maine.
Blimey, I've never seen so much sneezing. That's top notch. I feel like clapping.
Miss Slicket finally said,
Bless you.
in a slow, tense voice, and turned towards the blackboard once more.
Yawning, snoring, and giggling followed shortly afterwards, cracking the awed silence of the rest of the class, who all stared at this new, dirty boy that had joined them. Miss Lickett, not knowing what to say, didn't say anything at all, but kept her back to the class and etched more sums on the blackboard with ever more force.
Then Robin belched. Miss Slicket broke her chalk and span round to glare at him. Her chair was empty, so she instead glared at Billy Bamford. He pointed down to the floor where Robin was lying on his back beneath Henrietta Hodges' desk and staring up her skirt. Miss Slickett's face swam with expressions of such effrontery that many of the children blushed behind their hands. This was more fun than Blind Man's Bluff. This was more fun than hopscotch.
Master Goody, remove yourself from under Miss Hodges' petticoats and return to your chair.
Miss Slicket said as calmly as she could, though everyone could clearly see the white knuckles of her clenched fist by her side as Robin sprightly jumped up to his feet and winked at Henrietta.
And please refrain from your noises. We enjoy a quiet and collected classroom here, do we not, children?
Yes, Miss Lickett!
They all said as one.
Yes, Miss Lickett.
She quietly repeated.
Now shake a leg and get back to your chair.
Robin Goody lifted a leg, shook it, and sat back down, his grin still wide and toothsome.
By the end of that day, there was not one child who wasn't certain they'd met the finest boy who'd ever lived.
They all struggled to walk out single file, right foot first, shortest at the front, tallest at the back, into the school grounds, and not rush out and cheer for their new hero, lifting him onto their shoulders, parading him around the village.
But by the time they had got beyond the school gates and were all turning on their heels, he was nowhere to be found, and believe this storyteller when he says they tried everywhere, behind them, in front of them, and over the wall.
Don't ask me how I know this. I make it my business to know the ins and outs and corners and cupboards of the story. Without me, you'd be lost. You wouldn't know the joy of that evening. You wouldn't know that the children could hardly pause to think about Blind Man's Bluff or hopscotch. They were so brimful of chatter and laughter.
They didn't even hear the tinkling of Miss Slickett's bell as she passed them and continued home to a hard and empty bed. And you wouldn't know that in her bed, Miranda Slicket held on to her bell, feeling its cold shape between her fingers, and listened for nothing in the blackness all night long.
The pedals of her bone shaker were heavier to push the next morning, as she passed through the village and the cobbles threw her this way and that. Lovely morning!
Mr. Carroll, the churchwarden, cried.
Would you care to?
Mrs. Thomas the tailor began, and
Did you hear the one about?
Mr. Trigger the tanner tried.
Miranda Slicket huffed at all of them and kept her head down as she began her climb up Hope Hill, tutting to herself that the hill had grown steeper overnight.
Her class was led in the way they always were and found Robin Goody already sat at his desk, chewing the fingernails of one hand and waving vigorously at everyone with the other.
He looked more curdled than the day before, but his grin was still ear to ear as he spat his bitten-off nails onto the floor. They were all pleased to see this and hoped for another day of yawning and sneezing and belching.
None of them were disappointed. Yawning and sneezing and belching there was, and snoring and coughing and spitting, and an outbreak of the hiccups that looked to usurp the whole of reading time, were it not for a stray magpie that flew in through an open window. Children covered their heads with their slates, or swiped at it as it flapped aimlessly about in a terrified stupor. But Robin Goody stood up and plucked it from the air as if it was nothing more than an apple on a tree, and left the room. Everybody stared at the door as it shut behind him, and as much as I'd like to tell you what happened behind that door, I'm afraid I don't know. I only know that when he returned, there was something of the sunlight in his eyes and the devil in his smile.
Miss Slickett's patience was going thin, and if you, dear listener, could see into that classroom and walk up to our tall mistress You might be able to spot the small dots of blood on her hands as she squeezed her fist.
The day continued in this fist-squeezing white-knuckle way, as I am sure you can imagine, and ended soon enough with a weary nod of the head from Miss Lickard, less of a "you may now leave" nod than a "get out of here or I shall weep" nod.
Billy Bamford ran from the classroom through the hall until he was pulled by the hood of his coat away from his classmates and out into the afternoon sunshine. He tugged himself free, stood up straight and stared into the smiling, grubby face of Robin Goody. He smiled back and watched as Robin ran away, jumped over the far wall and headed up towards the graveyard of the neighbouring church.
At this moment in the story, a boy like Billy might look behind, ahead of him, and behind him again, weighing up his actions, but not this Billy. This Billy ran straight after Robin into the graveyard and sat down next to him, behind the iron railings of the crypt.
They both sat there in silence for some time, Billy blowing on dandelions and Robin biting the nails of his other hand and flicking them at clouds of midges. Billy hadn't really wondered what they were doing there until Robin elbowed him in the side and he span around.
Walking up the yard, stalking through the lines of headstones, was Miss Slicket, slow and sombre like a shadow against the darkening sky. Robin put one finger up to his lips as Miss Slicket picked a flower from the ground and gently placed it at the foot of a blank and sunken stone.
The two boys watched as Miss Slicket pushed down on her knees and stood up, and the two boys watched as Miss Slicket took hold of her small brass bell. Again she shook it, and again, each time listening for a reply, which never came. She soon tired of waiting, rubbed a hand across her eye, and left.
Robin left their hiding place and walked out to the stone. Billy lifted himself up and joined him, looking down on the blank stone. But Robin did not want to play and slapped his forehead.
So Billy stopped.
I'll wait for Robin to choose which game we'll play.
He decided, and soon enough Robin did decide on a new game. It didn't have a name that Billy knew of, but if it did have a name, it would probably be something like...
Let's see if we can pull up this gravestone.
Or...
Lifty Stone.
Or...
Pulley Rock.
Or something catchy like that. It seemed like a strange game, but Billy was willing to go along with it, and grabbed the other side of the rough stone with both hands and heaved.
The stone lifted out from the earth with a satisfying pop and fell back onto the ground. Billy looked down at it and immediately began to enjoy the new game. For though the stone was once blank, there was now deep, dark words all over it, no longer hidden in the dark ground. Words like
Ferdinand Fletcher, beloved husband, died at sea.
The words ran around inside Billy's mind until they settled and he looked up into Robin's face, wide eyes and ear-to-ear grin, nodding his head in a something, isn't it fashion.
Billy agreed. This was something. And if you're like me, you're probably wondering in a does that mean or could it be way whether or not our tall Miranda Slicket is indeed our tall Miranda Slicket at all.
And you'd be right to wonder.
That, however, didn't stop her peddling through the village the next morning after another silent, sleepless night.
Lovely morning.
Mr. Carroll the churchwarden would cry.
Would you care to?
Mrs. Thomas the tailor would begin, and
Did you hear the one about?
Mr. Trigger the tanner would try.
Miranda Slicket turned to the three as she passed, and didn't glance or tut or shake her head. Instead, she shouted, "Oh, sod off!" and pedalled on.
This is the point in the tale where I knew she would break. There would be more yawning, sneezing and belching and then snapping. But it wasn't the yawning, sneezing and belching that did it, nor the snoring, coughing and spitting.
It was the farting that did it. Long and low and rasping and altogether unwholesome. It was the farting that finally broke her.
That is it! She yelled, slapping her hands down on the desk in a way that could only mean,
That is it! I've given your common insolence enough of my patience, Master Goody. There is only one way to remove such behaviour. It must be beaten out till there is nothing left.
Robin Goody rubbed his hands together with glee.
Come to the front of the class, and don't forget to bring the cane.
Robin bounced off his chair, ran to the back wall, and took a long, thin cane at random and presented it to Miss Slicket. He then bent over the desk and presented his bare bottom.
With a practised hand, Miss Slicket whipped the cane through the air and planted her first strike on Robin's behind. All the class winced as it hit. And then there was silence. And then there was laughing. Not laughing from the class, and not laughing from Miss Slicket, but laughing from Robin Goody and his red rear. Miss Slicket struck again, but that didn't stop Robin's laughing. It only made it worse. Great hoots of hysterics burst out from him as Miss Slicket whipped and whacked and walloped until she was exhausted and in all disarray. Robin patted his hot, raw bum as he pulled up his trousers, and Miss Slicket fell back into her chair.
Master Bamford, take a book from the shelf and read it aloud, and do not stop until you are told.
Billy picked the first book he came to, a shiny new copy of a book entitled Skinny Robin and the Chimney, and began to read. It was the unusual tale of boy needs job, boy finds job, job bites boys behind. Billy heard a snivelling next to him. Turning, he saw his friend Robin no longer smiling ear to ear, but red-nosed and wet-eyed and wobbling-lipped.
Continue, child, Miss Slicket demanded from behind her desk.
Billy went on with the story, and soon got to the parts where Skinny Robin was in trouble. Robin Goody coughed next to Billy and began to quietly sob into his hands. Billy stopped reading and looked over at him.
Do not stop until you are told.
Billy started reading again, but when Skinny Robin was getting tired and afraid he wasn't going to see his sick mama again, the sobs grew so that he was having trouble hearing the sound of his own voice.
May I stop now, Miss Slicket?
Have I told you to stop, child?
No, miss, but it does seem to be upsetting Robin Goody.
Perhaps it might teach him a valuable lesson.
Please, Miss Slicket.
No!
Please, Miss Fletcher.
Miss Slicket's face dropped. Billy didn't know quite what had made him call her that, as though his mouth had taken over without asking the permission of the rest of him. But it was too late to take it back now. Billy waited, Robin stopped crying, and everybody looked at them.
What did you call me?
I mean, Miss Fletcher, miss. That was your name, wasn't it? How did you...
She followed his gaze, which landed on Robin Goody next to him. Everyone stared at Robin, picking his ear and smiling.
Who are you?
Robin didn't answer. He only looked up, took his finger out of his ear, put it in his smiling mouth, and bit it off. At times like this, if jaws really did fall to the floor, everyone's would have done so. Instead, all the class stared in amazement as Robin put another finger in his mouth and bit that off too. It didn't take him long to finish off all his fingers and then start on the stumps of his hands. He chewed and swallowed and smiled on every mouthful, and it wasn't longer before he'd started on his feet, biting through the leather of his shoes and scoffing a lot. Some parts were trickier than others, like reaching his elbows or his bony knees, but he managed nonetheless, and as he slurped up the last of his belt, what was left was a prickly, mottled and wrinkled thing, still smiling from ear to ear.
What are you?
Miss Slicket decided was a more appropriate question, staring at the strange, squat form. As it walked towards her, she backed up to the wall, but the spindly thing from inside Robin Goody took her hand in his and led her out of the classroom.
All the children watched them leave, and Billy couldn't help wishing he had listened to his pa, read that book, and learnt of fairies and magic and such.
The puck walked Miranda Slicket slowly, for his legs were no longer than bookends, out of the school ground, up to the church, and into its graveyard. They stopped and stood before the fallen stone that she visited every evening after school, and stood for what felt like a very long time, holding hands and waiting for words to come. Miranda Slicket sighed.
Ferdinand was my husband, don't you know? But of course you know this. He brought me here. A fine sailor he was, and an even finer man. Tall, too. The only admirer I ever had. I told him not to go, you see. I told him the cloak of a storm was coming in fast, and that spelt danger, but it fell on deaf ears. I didn't forgive him for that, for some time after he was gone, and I won't have a chance to tell him I forgive him now. I never said goodbye.
The Puck shook his head again and jumped from his short legs, freeing Miss Licket's brass belt from her waist.
He lifted the bell with both hands above his head and rang it out loud. The tinkling sounded all around them in that lonely yard, and the Puck bounced from one foot to the other.
Miranda Slicket felt the cold breeze pick up and dance with her as she held her head high in the quiet, until the quiet was broken by a hushed but definite answer of another bell ringing in the air.
Miranda Slicket snatched her own bell back from the Puck and rang it again. The answer came back faster still and embraced her with its near-forgotten voice.
That's Ferdinand's bell. That's my husband's bell. The pair were a wedding gift so we could find each other if we were ever parted in the woods when walking. How we loved to walk. If you will excuse me, I have not spoken 24 words together since he left, and my voice is a touch hoarse. Do you think he knows how I feel?
The Puck looked up at her and spoke in a voice like breaking wood.
With your husband's ringing bell, he finally wishes you his farewell. So apologies if my farting offended, for Robin has at last amended.
And the Puck walked away into the wall and was never seen by our tall mistress again. As he went, she lifted her head and looked out over the headlands once more and down towards Hope Village, feeling the warmth of the sun return to her bones. And this storyteller is delighted to tell you that for the first time in a very long while,
Miranda Slicket smiled.
This has been a Buchan School production, starring Gwen Thornton, Ava Melnick, Sophie Shepherd, Jack Hayward, Torrin Proctor, Jonathan Harmon, Grace Temple, Katie Lyman, Anya James, Zach Novak, and Joseph Quinn. The Tall Tale was written, produced, and directed by Alexander K. Duncan.